Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reporting on the Psychedelic Legal Renaissance. I'm Carmel Shachar, the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. We are delighted to host this conversation. I think it's always so interesting to understand how the stories, how the narrative, how the thinking around rapidly developing topics is shaped by some really interesting, cutting-edge, sophisticated journalism. Before we actually hear from our panelists, I want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. The first is that this is a moderated conversation, so we strongly welcome your questions so that our moderator can pull those questions and pose them to our panelists. By far and away, the best way to submit your questions is to use the Zoom Q&A feature found in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. We will be reviewing those questions and we will pull them out for our panelists. You are also welcome to join the conversation or even to submit questions on Twitter. We are at Petrie-Flom and you can use the hashtag Poplar. Again, that's hashtag Poplar, like the tree. On the other hand, if you have any technical issues, and I sure hope you don't, please email us at petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu. That is by far the best way to get our attention, and hopefully we can fix whatever's going wrong. If you're new to the Petrie-Flom Center and our events, I would strongly encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. It comes out only twice a month, so we don't spam your inbox too bad, and it's the best way to find out about some cutting-edge scholarship that we have, especially from our Poplar team, which works on the regulation of psychedelics. You can also read our blog, The Bill of Health, which seeks to make health law, health policy, bioethics very accessible. They're planning an upcoming digital symposium on microdosing that might be of interest to this audience, as well as check out our upcoming events. We host events that really run the gamut from looking at the use of digital health tech in the home to considering, for example, the interplay between the law and medical decision-making in prison systems. We have a whole host of events that are related to psychedelics that might be of interest to you. So we do hope we see you for future events. With all of that housekeeping out of the way, I would like to introduce our moderator, Mason Marks, MD, JD, who is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law, as well as Senior Fellow and Project Lead, as well as co-founder of the Project on Psychedelics Law and Regulation, also known as Poplar, at the Petrie-Flom Center. Mason, I will hand the event over to you.
Thanks so much, Carmel, and welcome everyone. I also want to thank Chloe Reichel and Laura Chong for helping to make this event possible. I'll just say a few opening remarks before we turn to the discussion. We're in a period that many people refer to as the psychedelic renaissance. It's a time when there's increased interest in producing, researching, and utilizing psychedelic substances like psilocybin, ibogaine, and dimethyltryptamine for a variety of purposes, including therapeutic applications. They're proving to be effective in the treatment of conditions like treatment-resistant depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and various substance use conditions like tobacco use, opioid use, alcohol use, etc. Part of this psychedelic renaissance is a wave of legal reforms that seems to be sweeping across the country. Starting in 2019, when Denver first decriminalized fungi containing psilocybin. And since then, there's been about a dozen other US cities that have either decriminalized, they've decriminalized psilocybin and certain other psychedelics. And about a dozen states have introduced legislation, or at least proposed legislation, to decriminalize or legalize psychedelics. For example, Oregon was the first state to pass such a bill in 2020, when it legalized the supported adult use of psilocybin administered by a trained and licensed facilitator. Today we have an amazing panel of journalists, probably some of the most knowledgeable and active journalists in this space. They are covering the field in real time as it unfolds. And I want to invite each of them to introduce themselves and spend a minute or two discussing what brought them to this space, why they think it's important, and anything else they'd like to say to sort of set up the conversation. And we'll start with Ritika and then move on to Shelby. So welcome, Ritika. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mason, and thank you for this wonderful invite. I feel so grateful to be joining other journalists whose work I really look up to. So thank you again. I'm a reporter in Toronto, Canada. And right now I'm working as a financial journalist with Proactive and freelancing in the psychedelic space. For the longest time, I was with Truffle Report, which unfortunately had to end. I started my career with Truffle Report after I finished my school here at Sheridan College. And I think this is a very timely conversation that we're bringing in journalists, because there's so many news organizations popping up that are focused on just psychedelics and all the developments in the space. So it is going to be big, and we need to hold them accountable. We need to understand what's going on, and alongside we need to understand, there's so much stigma and so much lack of awareness about these substances. So this is where our role comes in. What brought me to journalism was curiosity. Psychedelics was curiosity. I did not even know what psychedelics were before stepping into it. So I was starting from scratch. Yeah, that is my introduction. Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here. We'll move next to Shelby and then to Kyle.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for tuning in. I spent my whole career as a journalist and did a lot of different things, but my road to covering drug policy began in 2016 when I was covering Proposition 64, which was the bill that ultimately went on to legalize adult use cannabis in the state of California. First story I ever covered. My editor at LA Weekly sent me to a party the night of the presidential election to follow the passage of the bill. And I was just amazed by all the people that were there. It was my first time writing about drugs, even though I'd been smoking weed since I was 15. And I was just amazed by everyone in the room, the attorneys and the consultants and the publicists and the policymakers. And I realized that drugs were an amazing opportunity to not only write about drugs, but to write about so many of the most prescient issues that our society is facing, whether that be the FDA approval process and big pharma, mass incarceration, our current mental health epidemic, or even when we talk about psychedelics, things like mysticism and religion. So I became really fascinated in drugs as sort of a jumping off point to explore many other topics that I was interested in as well. And from there, just continued to freelance writing about psychedelics and cannabis, and then in 2019 had the idea for Double Blind, and so that's what I'm doing now. Double Blind is a magazine I run, for those of you who don't know, and we cover all things related to the psychedelic industry and movement. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Shelby. Kyle?
Yeah, thanks, Mason. Thanks for putting this together. Excited to be here. So I'm the senior editor of Marijuana Moment, which is a drug policy wire service. I know marijuana is in the title, but we cover psychedelics, harm reduction, every kind of everywhere in between. I have been covering drug policy for my entire journalistic career, and I think my first story was a DEA raid of a dispensary in Westwood, California. I was a UCLA student, and I was just kind of annoyed that they shut down my dispensary. And and I was an English literature major. I wasn't exactly sure I wanted to go the journalism track, but just in investigating it and in learning so much about the history of prohibition, it immediately attracted me. And what I found so amazing and why I was so attracted to drug policy is just because it does like Shelby mentioned, intersect with so many different aspects, whether it's the economy or health and science. And so there's never a dull moment in drug policy, and psychedelics being able to get on the ground floor of this, because, you know, medical systems, even adult use systems, were established for marijuana by the time I got into this. But the idea of being able to cover this from the grassroots to where it's at this stage has been really exciting.
Thanks, Kyle. Shayla, welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Shayla Love. I'm a senior staff writer at Vice. I'm a science journalist with a special focus on mental health, and I got into psychedelics journalism because several years ago, it just became unignorable that there were these studies coming out that had really exciting and promising results for a whole bunch of different conditions using psychedelic assisted therapy. So that was sort of my entry point. And also, you know, just studies probing how psychedelics can help us understand consciousness and other interesting aspects of the brain. So that was really my entry point in, and kind of similar to what Kyle said from a policy perspective, there were all these issues in mental health care that felt really impossible to sort of address or penetrate. And those are things like mental health parity with insurance coverage, regulating therapy, measuring the efficacy of different therapeutic modalities. All of these things felt really tough to tackle because these institutions had been in place for so long. But with psychedelic assisted therapy, you really see how all of these questions have to be addressed anew. And in some cases with psychedelic therapy, because things are sort of more enhanced and exaggerated, it requires a fresh perspective, but in a way that I think really trickles out into other kinds of mental health care. So that was a really exciting overlap for me, and one of the reasons that I spend so much time on this topic as I do now.
A couple of you mentioned one of the things that brought you to this space, or to write about this space, was how dynamic it is and how interdisciplinary it is. And you meet a lot of really interesting people from different facets of society. That alone, the interdisciplinarity of it, seems like it could be challenging because you have to become familiar with all of these different aspects of the industry. Do you think there are any other unique challenges that you face covering this space, or how might it differ covering psychedelics versus another area as a journalist?
I could probably answer that one, but speaking strictly from the perspective that I've only covered, you know, marijuana and drug policy, so I don't have a business background or any of this. But yeah, I mean, the dynamics are really interesting because my reporting is grounded in policy, but policy impacts people, and so when in trying to give this issue the attention and the balance it needs, there's a learning curve for me just in the terminology that's that's emerging. I had to learn what an entheogen was not too long ago, and in the impacted communities, because there are those differences, and so learning about the history of the particularly indigenous communities with these substances, it's been a challenge for me. And also, we like to provide a lot of context whenever we're reporting on, especially like cannabis policy. And the context for psychedelics is just so rapidly emerging. And there are so many different, policy proposals that are being introduced. I think that's a unique difference between at least covering the marijuana movement and the psychedelics movement.
And I think just comparing writing about psychedelics to other fields of health and science, I think there's a lot more philosophy involved in psychedelics. I'm a big advocate in like almost every form of science, you can find some sort of cultural history or philosophy there. But with psychedelics, there is, because of the nature of these experiences, people bring a lot of beliefs and ideas to the work, which is really fascinating. And even in the US, there's this long, rich history of what happened in the 50s and 60s and the legacy of people like Aldous Huxley and others, which trickles down today and informs the way people ask questions and the way they name experiences and how they want to measure them and the scales they use. So having that really sort of long tail of history in examining all of this and how it came to be makes it both really fun to report on, and also for me as a features writer always means that I'm like reading so much for every article or trying to maybe more than like another fields that exists that I might be reporting on.
Yeah, from the legal perspective, because I live in Canada and I'm also covering Canadian legal space and psychedelics, and also regularly reporting on the US. So those two are different, you know, the way psychedelic laws or just controlled substances are defined in the Canadian Drugs and Substances Act compared to the Americans are different. So, you know, that also creates a little bit of challenge for me to always keep that in mind, that as a reporter, I am doing both the things and they can't be mixed or they can't be confused because it will give a wrong message to readers. So that is my personal challenge that has been.
I want to ask you a little bit more about your choice of language. Kyle, you mentioned sometimes having to learn what the word entheogen means, which a lot of people use as a synonym or an alternative to the word psychedelic. How do you handle word choice and how do you decide? Because it seems like there's a lot of situations where you have a variety of choices. I think in the drug policy space, people are often concerned about using words that might be overly stigmatizing of certain populations. How do you learn all this? How do you decide what to use?
You know, a lot of it is on a case by case basis, but I think what I tend to do within the body of a given article is just diversify. And, you know, if it's a activist-led resolution they're introducing to city council and they use the term entheogen, you know, and they're not using psychedelics so much, then I try to incorporate that and give definitions to readers who might not be less familiar. But it's a challenge because this isn't, you know, not all of our readers, even though they tend to be fairly astute on drug policy issues, would understand if I put something in a headline like city council passes entheogenic deprioritization bill, you know, so I have to make that kind of editorial decision. Psychedelics decriminalization bill advances out of committee, you know, and so I've gotten pushback from the community over that terminology, and I try to be sensitive in the same way that, you know, there's people who take issue with the use of marijuana for varying reasons. And so you'll see in any given article I write about a marijuana issue, I, you know, switch it up, marijuana, cannabis, just paying deference to those sensitivities and in trying to incorporate the language of the people behind a given piece of legislation or given proposal to the best that I can without confusing the reader. I think that's how I'd answer that.
That's a great point, because it does seem like, well, go ahead, Shelby, please.
Oh, I was just going to chime in and say that's something that I think journalists deal with across beats, right? Is you want to be nuanced enough that you're being accurate, and you want to be broad enough that people who are not intimately familiar with the conversation are going to understand what you're talking about.
Have any of you faced a pushback because you report in this area? Have people told you, because I raise this because psychedelics have been stigmatized for many, many years. So has anyone told you, don't write about that? That's not a legitimate area of journalism. Or when you talk to sources, do you ever find people sort of unwilling to talk about psychedelics because they've been stigmatized for such a long time?
I think within the space, I've never had any pushback. People are very cooperative and ready to share their experiences. But outside of the space, I have had experiences when I told people that I write about psychedelics, one person just immediately assumed that I'm a drug addict, or that I just like getting high, or I just like seeing colors when I'm high on drugs, whatever. Like, they have their misconceptions. And then the other kind of misconception is, of course, it's just stigmatized. So they're not open to the idea. They're not aware of what's going on. In our psychedelic space, we know there's a lot of research. We know there's a lot of advocacy going on, but sometimes it becomes an echo chamber. And, as Kyle mentioned, that we need to, simplify it. Sorry, Shelby mentioned that we need to simplify it so that people are able to understand, we're not confusing them. So those are the kind of feedback that I get when I say that I report on psychedelics, that they automatically think that I am into drugs, which is not true. And I think there needs to be more awareness that psychedelic journalism is not being addicted to stuff, it is reporting on what's going on in the space.
Yeah, it makes me think about how several years ago I wrote an article about whether or not psychedelic therapists and researchers, mostly researchers at the time, should have had a psychedelic experience themselves. And this is still kind of an open question now, like how much personal experience should a researcher or therapist have? Is that necessary in order for them to properly understand the topic or help a patient? And at that time, when I was emailing researchers for that article, most of them wanted to be anonymous for that piece. And I've thought recently, I feel like if I wrote it now, it wouldn't be as big of a deal, maybe depending on their institutional situation. But I think the legal situation has even felt so different in the past few years than it did 3 years ago, because of Oregon, because of other states decriminalizing, because of FDA approval around the corner. And I feel it's reflected similarly in journalism. A couple years ago, I definitely got the same thing where if you said you were writing about psychedelics, people would make a lot of assumptions about you. But now, there's been coverage in almost every single major newspaper recently, every single major online publication as well. So I think it's definitely changing, but it's pretty new within the last couple of years.
Yeah, I would say I've had a different experience just, again, focusing on the policy front, and especially with activist-led campaigns. I mean, the most pushback I get are from allies in the movement who are very sensitive, because we like to be first to report stuff, and so when we get a tip about a forthcoming bill or a forthcoming initiative, we want to be the first to report it. And the strategies behind these more novel ballot initiatives leads to a lot of hesitancy to even have the media exposure in the first place. And so I get pushed back hey, hold off on this. And I'm like, I can't, because if it gets leaked somewhere else, I'm not, and that's not my job. My job is to report the bills that I get or whatever kind of information I get. But beyond kind of pushback on terminology, just the nature of giving mainstream attention to these incremental steps building up to what they're seeking to accomplish, that's where I've gotten a lot of pushback. I mean, and then of course you have the SAMs of the world, but prohibitionists are going to prohibition. So.
I haven't received that much pushback from folks that I contact to interview for my stories. That being said, I definitely get reactions sometimes when I'm just out and about in my life and I tell people what I do. I still am amazed by how many people say things like, psychedelics, isn't that, aren't those the things from the 60s and Tim Leary and acid in San Francisco? More and more people are coming to know, obviously, what's happening within the realm of psychedelics, largely because of what some people refer to as the, quote, pollen effect, which happened as a result of Michael Pollan's book, which became a New York Times bestseller. And, some of the mainstream coverage around the Hopkins and NYU trials and some of these more robust clinical trials investigating these different compounds that are working their way through the FDA. But many, many people, I think, all across the United States and the world still actually have no idea what's happening within the realm of psychedelics.
We have a question from the audience from Dan, who asks, what amount of responsibility should journalists take to not oversell or sensationalize these substances? So sometimes you'll hear in the media or from people in the community that taking a substance like psilocybin, for example, might be equivalent to doing 10 years of therapy. So how do you stay balanced, and what responsibility do you have to not, as a journalist, to not oversell these substances?
I'd love to answer this first. I just wanted to add that recently it was said by the head of a psychedelic company, not 10 years of therapy, but 10,000 years of therapy. So now we're like ascending into some, you know, plane of human existence that I didn't even know was possible with therapy. But I think journalists have a huge responsibility in this domain. And this like 10 years of therapy in 1 hour or something is something that I have a huge issue with as a mental health reporter, because I don't even really know what that means, right? I've probably been in therapy about 10 years, and I'm not sure I would want that accelerated into 1 hour, or I don't even know what that experience would be like. I think it's sort of a poor analogy. And I think when we talk about these substances in the context of people who are vulnerable and are seeking them out for help, we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we are balanced and saying both what the potential benefits are, but also the potential harms or the potential sort of like non-effects. And I think that people, when they are curious about psychedelics, they turn to the mass media to understand what it is. This is sort of like a journalist's job, is communication and education. And so when things are overblown, it has really significant ripple effects. And I see them in my email inbox all the time, honestly, of people having bad outcomes and they thought it was just going to be this easy process. So I come at this from a mental health perspective, but I think it applies more broadly, that there can be reasons to be really excited and also reasons to cover sort of the legalization process. But there's a huge responsibility to make sure that what's communicated doesn't sort of build hype and get people into situations that are going to harm them.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And just going back to kind of what I said before in regards to best practices for journalism more broadly, I think that good reporting comes down to what my mentor often said was reading your work like your enemy would. So, you know, a lot of journalists in this space, myself included, have had profound psychedelic experiences, but it is my responsibility, it's every journalist's responsibility to constantly be conscientious of their cognitive bias and to keep themselves in check. What am I missing here? What kind of voices do I need to be including that I'm not including? Where are some of the logical holes? Because, you know, it's one thing to write an op-ed and a think piece, and that's okay. And that's a type of journalism or writing that happens in newspapers and magazines. It's been happening forever in newspapers and magazines. And it's where you come out and you say, this is my opinion and I'm writing about my opinion. But if you're going to present a piece as though it's reported, and you're going to go out and you're going to do research and interview different people, you know, it's best practices 101 to seek alternative perspectives and to make sure that you're not reinforcing some kind of unconscious narrative or agenda.
Just to kind of return to the stigma for a moment, Shelby, I read something about some of your work at Double Blind being taken down by Instagram. And I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about that. You know, perhaps we might not see pushback from sources or members of the community, but social media companies might decide. And there have been cases regarding Facebook, where Facebook has taken down posts about ayahuasca, and then that case got escalated to the Facebook Oversight Board, which is sort of an appellate body for these content moderation decisions. But what's your perspective on that, having experienced some of that?
So we have absolutely no idea why some posts get taken down and other posts don't get taken down. We can't figure it out. And I'll just say that this is not just an Instagram problem or a Facebook problem. This is a much larger issue in our society, which is that not just journalism companies, but companies in general are depending upon third-party platforms that they have no control over. And that includes Google, and it includes TikTok, and it includes every kind of social media platform you can imagine. We've had issues with our YouTube. And the thing that's most frustrating about all of this is how cryptic it is, because all of these platforms do have acceptable use policies, but we've read through the acceptable use policies and we can't figure out what we did wrong. And when you actually try and contact these platforms for meaningful information about what you did wrong, you just get some kind of, automatic reply that says something like, you violated our policy and we'll get back to you, at some point. And we've had our Instagram taken down twice now, and both times that we've gotten it back, I just get an email saying, sorry, we took it down on accident, you're back. So it's, I also want to just say, in December of 2020, all the media sites in the psychedelic space, as far as I'm aware, all the ones that I've spoken to, had their traffic cut in half, roughly, organically through Google. Google updated their algorithm, and overnight we lost half of our traffic. And we've spoken to SEO experts about this, search engine optimization experts, and they are referring to this algorithm update as the medic update. So basically what happened is that Google started prioritizing rehab and addiction sites and government websites over websites that primarily talk about psychedelics. And so we had a lot of educational content as well on, it's kind of based in the principle of harm reduction, explaining, like, for example, 2CB, what is it? What do we know about contraindications and risks? What do we know about, the history of the drug? And now that article, which, I'm biased, but I think was a pretty great explainer on that drug, is buried on like page 6 of Google, and in its place comes up stuff about how 2CB is just addictive. And, it's frustrating, again, because it's like we don't get any meaningful information or any heads up as to why that happened. We also lost our PayPal. Again, they say we violated their policy. We can't figure out what we did wrong. And so at the end of the day, it's just, there's a lot of companies that are working really hard to do good work, both inside and outside of the journalism industry. And it does feel like we're kind of at the whim of these platforms that any day can decide that they're going to change how their algorithm works. And everyone kind of just has to do their best to figure it out.
You all are very experienced with using social media, and you use it very effectively to promote your stories. What can you tell us about that? What role does social media play for you, I guess, in terms of learning about things to potentially cover, as well as using it to promote your work?
I usually use it to learn about most of the things that are going around. So Marijuana Moment, for example, is the bell icon for me. Like, the notification goes up and it sends me a notification. Then there's Graham Peshenik, who's also the same. He posts something, it comes up as a notification. So Twitter is like a platform where I can look for stories. Same for LinkedIn. So there's always like somebody posting about recent research or legal movements or advocacy groups coming up with their new, projects or campaigns. So that is how it works for me. But I think, what Shelby said, it does make sense. Trouble went down, and it was the hardest thing for me to absorb. Like, we as a team worked so hard to put it up and, kept it running. And I'm proud of the work we did over there. But it had to end. And I think a lot of that has to do with all the algorithms and how it works against us, because we're writing about drugs. But at the same time, we are trying to, create an awareness, create, education about these substances. Well, I don't know how that works. Social media is really chaotic and massive. So it works as a source for me. I am not very active when it comes to, promoting my stories. But it is something that is an open source of information.
Yeah, I would say Marijuana Moment has been lucky to avoid some of these more serious censorships. We'll get an occasional Facebook fan or reader who will be like, hey, just so you guys know, you've been shadow banned. And then I'll personally, even though I'm an admin on the page, struggle to find my own company when I'm searching it independently. But that's been, we haven't faced any shutdown. We're also not especially active on Instagram, where I think a lot of these issues are occurring. But in terms of using Twitter as a source, I mean, it's a huge promotional asset for us. Tom posts every single article in real time with, the context that you need, in addition to kind of our automated marijuana moment feed. I try as best I can to, post stories when we come up with it. But since we are covering, the full spectrum, local city councils, state legislatures, Congress, I'm not on the floor when that's happening. And there's not always a live stream or live audio. And so I really and oftentimes depend on the reporters who are there, who are able to provide the kind of insights, the procedural insights, the conversations that are happening, in committee. And, it's also valuable, sometimes people will share the text of the bill that they get, before it's posted online the next day. And so those are, Twitter is a huge asset for us, especially when, I'm here in Sacramento, Tom's in Brooklyn, we've got another freelancer in Seattle, that we can't do it all without Twitter.
Yeah, I'll just agree that Twitter is a huge resource for me as well. It's also just really helpful to see people having conversations and dialogues back and forth, even sometimes a bit contentious ones or spicy ones, because I think seeing what people are discussing and talking about, even in that setting, which is sort of truncated, right? Everybody's limited by their characters, is useful in thinking just about what are the big picture issues that people are worrying about and talking about. And I love when researchers post their studies on Twitter. That's a huge place for me to find out what people are publishing or about to publish. Sometimes people will write about preprints that are coming out, and I can see those easily there. So yeah, and I try to always share my psychedelic work, but then also my other journalism on Twitter too. I'm not the best. I don't know. I feel really like I have some colleagues who are so good at their Twitter, and they're so funny, and they share so much of themselves. And I think they do such a good job at it. At the moment, I think I'm pretty good at sharing my work, but it'd be cool to use it more in that capacity too someday.
Just to be clear, Truffle did not close because we got banned on social media. It was just internal reasons.
That was how I found you. Truffle Report was a really great source, and your work there was outstanding. So that was definitely sad news for me, I think, and a loss to the community. Are there any other tools you rely on as a journalist to hear about stories? I guess it's kind of interesting to hear a little bit inside your, a little bit of the craft, and for people who just want to stay up on what's happening in this industry, it can be very difficult because, like some of you mentioned, it's changing very quickly. Even in the past 2 years, things have evolved very rapidly. So if you're not really paying attention, like the cannabis industry has been, so are there any other tools you use to just kind of stay up to date?
I mean, I always find my best stories talking to people. It's always been how I've done things.
How has that been in this, last couple of years?
I guess it's been harder since I'm not talking to as many people. I'm in my house more. But yeah, I think that stories are everywhere. And, ever since I became trained as a journalist, I see them everywhere. I sometimes joke that I see the world in stories. I just walk down the street and talking to somebody and, oh, a story, look, a story. Yeah, I don't know, talking to, tuning into panels and things, and someone will just mention something in passing. And I'm like, I didn't know that was happening. Like, I just found out that there's I think they're in phase 3 actually for psilocybin for alcohol use disorder. I don't know if anyone on this panel knew that was happening, but I didn't. And I was amazed because I thought that, the only studies that had gotten that far along for psilocybin were treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. But there's been this company that's kind of quietly been chugging along that I had never heard of before. So there you go, there's a story. One of you can have it. I don't have time.
Yeah, I think similarly talking to people, and as some other people mentioned before, something that I think about a lot for story ideas is how psychedelics are going to integrate into pre-existing structures. So again, with mental health, thinking about this a lot. So like, okay, let's say that psychedelic assisted therapy is available. How's that going to work with the therapeutic relationship or guidelines we have about how therapists practice? How's it going to work with insurance coverage? So thinking about all of these overlaps between systems that already exist and thinking, you know, how is that going to work? And then going and talking to people in related fields. And I think a benefit of that is it really widens your source pool as well, because you can talk to people with expertise in areas that will be relevant to psychedelics, who maybe aren't necessarily like psychedelic experts at the moment, but they have all of this requisite knowledge that can be really useful and applicable to these stories too. So yeah, just highlighting again that interdisciplinary nature of the field, which is so cool.
Yeah, I'd echo both of those points. Talking to people, you know, for me, it's a lot of staff, you know, whether it's on the Hill or in legislatures, building those relationships and building that trust has just been absolutely essential, because, you know, some will then proactively reach out to me. But if I could do a plug here, because it does help my own reporting, but I'm sure it's helpful to other reporters and readers. You know, we have built a bill tracking database. I forget the company that we partner with, but essentially we're primarily a reader-funded media organization. And so if you were to make a $25 a month contribution, we have a bill tracker that for this session alone has over 1,000 bills that we're following. And there's sort of a heat map on which state that you could select, and it'll go through. It'll show you each bill that's been introduced, its sponsor, its assigned committee, where the vote and committee comes from. And so if you're someone who's cares, you know, no one can cover it all, you know, certainly not a two-person team or even, you know, a large media organization, just because by nature of how quickly drug policy is advancing in this country. But we do have that resource that I use personally to, you know, just kind of check, was there something I missed? But you know, that's also something we use.
So for me, it was, sorry.
Go ahead, please. No, please.
It was a bit unique because I started reporting on in the psychedelic space during COVID, so I couldn't go around and talk to a lot of people. And I didn't know a lot of people in the space as well, because again, I was starting from scratch. So I was relying a lot on social media, of course, and Google. So Google Alerts were my favorite resource. Every morning, like 6 a.m., I'll get a whole bunch of notifications of what's going around, and then I'll try and figure out the patterns, what's the most common pattern, or I'll just, you know, bookmark some important conversations. And that is how, you know, I got an idea to whom to talk to and how to approach stories and how to find angles. And again, as Shelby said, yeah, I'm trained as a journalist, so I can find story anywhere. Like, it's in the air for me. I just need to look at the right place.
And a couple members of the audience mentioned some other sources like Reddit and Patreon. And Kyle, is that through Patreon? If people want to receive those benefits, they can find Marijuana Moment there, right?
Yeah, there's varying levels of support that you can do, but when you reach that $25 per month, that's when you get access to our bill tracker, and it's everything from CBD, hemp, marijuana, you know, medical, adult use, psychedelics, it's harm reduction, opioid stuff. There's a lot to digest, and especially if you're interested in a particular state, you know, I think that's it's been a really valuable asset to a lot of people who subscribe to it, but through Patreon, yes.
So without asking any of you to reveal too much about an ongoing story or something you're working on, what do you think are some of the maybe underreported areas of this space that you think deserve a little more attention?
Maybe I can go first again. I do feel that the diversity and equity side of psychedelics deserve more attention. that side is underrepresented. And I realized it when I was reporting on a story about reciprocity in the psychedelic space. So how Native Americans and indigenous communities share a very strong bond with the psychedelic substances, and how sometimes that gets subsided when it comes to research, when it comes to, building laws around it. We tend to overlook it. We just take it for granted. Their knowledge is taken for granted, or just not acknowledge that it's there. So, when I reported on that particular article, it just felt like that's not enough and we need to expand on it. So Chakruna does a good job on that. I've seen other journalists working on that too. Lucid News is also doing a great job on that. But I think there is more attention to be given to that, because psychedelic substances do share a very important bond with Native Americans, and we need to acknowledge that traditional knowledge and bring it to the Western community instead of just subsiding it or overlooking it.
I think that I'd like to see more done, and looking to do more on this, on just kind of the nitty-gritty of the logistics. I mentioned before how FDA has never regulated a therapy before. And I think in terms of mental health, when we talk about ethics, access is a huge issue, and it's an issue that we have already, and it contributes to the mental health concerns already that we have in this country, included in broader concerns around healthcare coverage. So even though these are all kind of hypothetical questions now, I really have kind of like a mechanistic mind where, like, I want to know exactly how it's going to work. Like, I'm not that worried about insurance covering the compounds themselves, which seem to be pretty cheap to make, especially in the medical model when they might be synthetic. But the question of covering therapy and how that's going to be accessible, I think, is still a huge open question. And this can't be a paradigm shift in mental health coverage if, when it rolls out, just like the same people can't access it, right? So to me, access is a big question, and these sort of technical logistics about what it's going to look like. So I'm pretty comfortable with the amount that's been covered in terms of like efficacy. Like, I think there's a lot of coverage all the time on the studies and what they're showing, and the fact that these substances are promising. I think now it's about like delivery, and that's really an area that I think needs more focus.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I guess I wouldn't say this is underreported, but something that I'm really interested in following this year and next year is just where the federal government is going to stand on this issue. We've seen, I think Oregon took a very bold step, and, we haven't exactly seen a direct response from the feds. Is it going to be a hands-off approach like cannabis, or is this the kind of thing that's going to ignite an enforcement action? And I think one of the things that we'll see sooner rather than later is this lawsuit brought against DEA by a Washington doctor, essentially saying that DEA is not respecting the intent of right to try laws, and he's trying to get access to psilocybin for these certain terminally ill patients. I can't remember exactly when DEA's response is due, but you have a Biden administration that really has been putting a lot of rhetoric into harm reduction, and this, theoretically could be a harm reduction tool, especially in these limited circumstances. So I think following the federal response and seeing where psychedelics policy and right to try legislation interlap is going to be really interesting. And there were several members of Congress in a letter led by Congressman Blumenauer asking the DEA administrator to weigh in on this. So it's just, I'm eager to see some more reporting on the federal response to this movement.
I love all those responses. I want to see more reporting on all of that. And if I was going to just add a couple more things, one would be more nuanced reporting around the difference between the varying decriminalization bills that are emerging and sort of the ideologies that are inspiring them. So, in Oregon, we had the decriminalization of all drugs at the ballot box in November, and that was seen as a big win for the criminal justice community. And, there are some people who are not in favor of taking this kind of piecemeal approach where we're just decriminalizing psychedelics as opposed to all drugs, because they say that it reinforces this concept of psychedelic exceptionalism, or this idea that some drugs are better than other drugs, or some people who use certain kinds of drugs are better than other people who use other kinds of drugs. And so I'm interested in seeing more of a bridge within the psychedelic movement, but also within psychedelic reporting between psychedelics, what's happening within the realm of psychedelics, and efforts that are being taken around broader criminal justice reform. And then secondarily, I'm also interested in seeing more reporting around the religious or spiritual use of psychedelics, because in cannabis, we did see this false dichotomy created within policy where we're really conceiving of only two ways that people can take this plant. And the first is recreationally, and the second is medicinally, when we know that actually a lot of times people seek to have a medicinal experience and it turns out to be very joyful and playful. And other times people can go into an experience just intending to have fun with their friends, and some serious stuff can come up around their internal distress or their mental health. And also, both of these experiences can have elements of spirituality or mysticism intertwined within them. And there are a lot of groups across the United States right now who have not been granted exemption from the Controlled Substances Act, who claim to be using psychedelics for spiritual reasons. And so, I think it's amazing that we're seeing coverage of the policy. It's amazing that we're seeing coverage of what's happening within drug development and the FDA, but I just don't want to leave out this entire population of people who also claim that psychedelics can be used for legitimate religious reasons, even if they don't have an ancestral tie to the compound that they're using.
We have a question from a nurse, Deb McCauley, who is also now a law student, and says that she subscribes to all your publications and sees you as the nurses of the news. You're the boots on the ground, getting the information out there. As an academic, I know I rely on your work extensively to get that news. But Deb is interested in where you think things are going legislatively. Given all you've learned and written about, what do you think we might see in the next few years in terms of state and federal laws on psychedelics?
I guess that's my wheelhouse. I think that we're, when Denver decriminalized psilocybin in 2019, it wasn't like too shortly after that Decriminalized Nature put out a map where they were showing 100 different cities where similar reform models might be pursued. And I remember thinking, I was like, there's just no way, it can't spread that quickly. And I was proven wrong. I mean, I think we'll continue to see this local level grassroots movement spread rapidly. And the fact that we have seen, like you mentioned earlier in your introduction, Mason, about a dozen states either introduce or advance legislation. And really interesting to me is just how many of them have been introduced by Republican lawmakers and to traditionally conservative state legislatures, right? And so I think that there's an interesting bipartisan appetite for this reform that I think we're going to see start with the incremental study task force type bills, maybe flirting with some kind of medical implementation, especially if we're able to see good progress out of Oregon. I don't want to speak to the federal government because marijuana is still prohibited. So I think that we're, a ways away from seeing some really bold reform on that front. But I think this session has already proven to be an incredibly exciting and active, and I would say in the next couple of years we're going to be seeing some really interesting reforms at the state level. If that answers the question.
I'll just add one thing about FDA approval, which is that you know, like Kyle said, there's no kind of like predicting what the federal government will do, but I've had lots of sources say to me that they believe FDA approval could impact scheduling in some way, shape, or form, because if something is FDA approved, it sort of changes like the risk and danger level implicitly of a substance. So that could be something that's happening, that could happen at some point, but again, impossible to predict exactly what that would be if it happens.
Yeah, in Canadian context, we are having like a slow federal movement. We're having drafts submitted to Health Canada based on our existing cannabis law. So that kind of makes a pathway for us to approach palliative access for psilocybin. And although like there are a lot of movements going on, I can see that it will take at least 2 or 3 years to, you know, for it to actually take a shape. But even the government is responding because there's a lot of pressure on the government. So, for example, Terrasil is doing some amazing advocacy, and they are receiving hundreds of applications to get access for psilocybin, because all those people are suffering from end of life distress, and they need that medication because, you know, they're suffering from treatment-resistant depression or anxiety. So Health Canada is taking cautious steps, like in a way that they just allowed special access program. So they can get access to psilocybin, but that's not enough. And the current method of Section 56 exemption is not enough. So we are slowly but gradually moving, and we might see something, you know, something like medical psilocybin maybe in 2 or 3 years. And I'm really hopeful that I'm proved wrong and it happens faster, but yeah.
It seems like a lot of your work involves interfacing with legislators and government agencies, and I'm curious to know how receptive they've been to your inquiries. So when, you know, Kyle, you mentioned the DEA. I know a lot of you work with state health departments. What has been their response to your contacting them and asking for information? And are there any tricks you use to get that information?
No, I wouldn't say any tricks. I've had, you know, good relationships with staff at, you know, from USDA to FDA to NIDA, which is one of the more surprising ones for me. You know, I had a chance to interview NIDA director Norvalco last year, and we had a really candid discussion about psychedelics, that, you know, as a survey showing increased use amongst adult groups, and I, you know, it's been simple reach out from my perspective. But in terms of you know, talking to members of Congress, they're a little bit more recalcitrant. I think I had Congressman Blumenauer and his office and our work have had really good relationships, and we've had you know, a lot of conversations about psychedelics. But I think I got him to be the first sitting member of Congress to endorse the Oregon initiatives in one of our conversations. But for the most part, a little bit trickier talking to members of Congress. But I've seen a really positive reaction from state lawmakers who are advancing this issue, including some of the GOP members who I think, you know, or I would have assumed maybe, you know, they're putting this out there, but they don't want to like stand up on the podium championing it. But, you know, I mean, they're really thoughtfully talking about this with me, and it hasn't been, it uniquely has not been much of a struggle for me, at least, to have these conversations both at the federal and state level.
Some, not really like people in government, but sadly, I have yet to have a USPTO patent examiner respond to an email of mine, which is sad. Maybe they're not allowed to, but the patent examiners is a barrier I haven't yet crossed, even though I've sent many of them an email.
I'll also sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I mean, the only government agency that I've really tried to get a hold of consistently is the VA, because I did a lot of reporting on veterans, and the VA, yeah, it's really hard to get the VA to reply to anything. meaningfully. That's been my experience. That said, you know, I've only been reporting on stories in which I'm trying to ask them why they won't engage in, they finally are engaging in psychedelic research, but back when I was really covering this, they were not engaging in MDMA research. They were not supporting whole plant cannabis trials. They were not even putting out information to veterans at these centers to let them know these trials are happening if they wanted to enroll. And the only way that I was able to get some meaningful information was by scouring the internet for researchers affiliated with the VA who had a history studying psychedelics, and some of them were willing to kind of talk to me off the record. But for the most part, when I email people, you know, directly at the VA, researchers or something, to just try and go around the press office, they always end up looping back in the same person who says, basically, go away. So
I think I would say DEA. There have been so many changes, and they just banned 5 substances of tryptamine, if I'm right. Sometimes I get confused with my substances, I'm sorry. But it's so hard to speak to them. I think it's the same thing, they're not allowed to talk to press. And even with the RTD Seattle doctor who filed a petition, I wanted to get a balanced reporting out on that. But I can only get one lawyer to speak on behalf of the doctor, but nothing on behalf of DEA. So it's so hard to, you know, just get their opinion or their comments. In Canada, I've never faced anything. Health Canada is responsive. Provincial health government is responsive. They all respond, although it takes time, but they never let it slide. So I like that.
That's really interesting. Well, we're out of time. I can't believe it. It's been a pleasure to have all of you here. I'm a great admirer of your work. I really appreciate it. I'm sure there are many great things to come in this space, and I look forward to reading your future stories, and I hope we can continue this conversation. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to everyone in the audience for attending. A video of this will be posted in the next couple weeks, and hope you have a great day. Great week. Take care.